Imagine getting a message in the middle of the night from someone you've never fully trusted, a message you didn't ask for, a message that once you see it, you cannot unsee. Now imagine that the message isn't words. It isn't a threat written out in text. It's a photograph. And what's in that photograph is someone you love. That is how the family of Lazette King found out she was gone. Not through a phone call from the police. Not through a knock on the door at 2 a.m. They found out because the man who killed her wanted them to know. He wanted them to see it. He chose to send proof not out of remorse, not out of confusion, but with the kind of cold deliberateness that makes investigators stop and ask a question that goes far beyond motive. They didn't just ask what happened. They asked what kind of person does something like that. And what does it tell us about everything that led up to that moment? This is the story of Lazette King, a 45-year-old mother from southeast Houston, Texas, who was described by the people who loved her as free-spirited, warm-hearted, and generous to a fault. A woman who, by all accounts, gave more to the people around her than most people ever think to give. And a woman who spent the last 6 years of her life inside a relationship that her own family feared would one day lead to exactly this. Welcome to Behind the Evidence. If you're new here, this channel is where we go beyond the headlines and look at the full picture, the psychology, the patterns, the failures, and the truth that doesn't always make it into the news cycle. If that sounds like something you want more of, hit subscribe right now because we cover cases like this every week and you don't want to miss what's coming. Now, let's get into it. Southeast Houston is a part of the city that doesn't always make the front page. It's a working-class stretch of Harris County that most people pass through rather than talk about, apartment complexes stacked along wide roads, the kind of neighborhoods where people keep to themselves, where noise after midnight isn't unusual, and where the line between a domestic argument and something far worse can be crossed before anyone outside those four walls even realizes what's happening. It was in one of those apartment complexes, on Fairway Drive, that Lazette King spent the last moments of her life on the night of June 16, 2025. She had been living there with Michael Ellis, a 48-year-old man she had been involved with for roughly 6 years. And the word involved is being used deliberately here because the nature of their relationship was not simple, and it had not been simple for a long time. By the time that night arrived, the couple had reportedly broken up, and yet they were still living in the same space, still sharing the same apartment, still navigating the same tension that had been building, according to the people who knew them, for years. That detail, the broken-up couple still under one roof, is one of the most significant factors in this entire case, and it is one that domestic violence researchers will tell you represents one of the most dangerous transitional periods in any abusive relationship. When a relationship ends but the physical proximity doesn't, the risk doesn't go down. It goes up, sometimes dramatically. But before we get to what happened inside that apartment on Fairway Drive, we have to go back a few hours earlier that same evening. Because June 16, 2025, did not begin with Lazette King. It began somewhere else entirely, with a different victim, and a different act of violence, one that, in hindsight, should have been a flashing red signal that something catastrophic was already in motion. Earlier that Tuesday evening, Michael Ellis allegedly shot a man, not inside an apartment, not in private. He reportedly shot another individual in the leg out in the open, and that person was found wounded near South Loop East. Police responded. The investigation began, and then Ellis was gone. He didn't stay at the scene. He didn't turn himself in. He moved deliberately with apparent purpose back toward the apartment on Fairway Drive, back toward Lazette King. And at approximately 11:05 p.m., Houston police received a call that would take them to that complex. When officers arrived, the situation was already fragmented and alarming. It wasn't entirely clear to the first responders exactly what they were walking into, but investigators pieced together that SWAT was eventually called to make entry into King's apartment. When those officers breached the door, they found Lazette King unresponsive. She had been shot. She was pronounced dead at the scene. And by that point, Michael Ellis was already gone again. This is where the case shifts, where it moves from a tragic domestic homicide into something with a darker, more calculated texture. Because it wasn't just that Ellis left. It was what he did before he left. At some point after Lazette King was shot, Ellis took out his phone. He took a photograph, and then he sent it. He sent graphic images of King's body to members of his own family. Let that settle for a moment because it is worth sitting with. This was not a confused man in the aftermath of an impulsive act. This was a man who stopped, who deliberately documented what he had done, who made a choice, a conscious, multi-step choice, to communicate that act to other people. In the psychological literature around intimate partner homicide, this kind of behavior is extraordinarily rare and extraordinarily telling. It suggests something beyond rage. It suggests a need for recognition, a need to be seen, a need to assert, even in the darkest and most unforgivable moment, that he had control over what happened. His sister received those images, and what she did next is one of the few things in this entire story that can be described, without hesitation, as an act of genuine courage. She called 911. She told police what had happened. And then she called King's family to warn them that her brother had allegedly sent a message alongside those photographs, that he wasn't done, that he was on his way to find them next. King's sister, Shatina Thompson, received that warning in the early hours of the morning. She immediately understood the severity of what was being communicated. Ellis had been in this family's orbit for 6 years. He knew where their parents lived. He knew their routines. He had not just committed one act of violence that night. He had allegedly shot someone earlier, then killed Lazette King, and was now allegedly threatening to extend that violence to an entire family. Thompson and others in the family immediately moved their parents out of their home. They didn't wait. They didn't deliberate. They got up and they moved because the threat was real. After all, they knew Michael Ellis, and because they had lived for years with the quiet, grinding fear that something like this was always possible. And that fear, that long-standing, well-founded fear, is one of the most important threads running through this entire case. When a homicide occurs inside a relationship, investigators and psychologists alike turn their attention to what preceded it. Not to assign blame to the victim, not ever, but because patterns of behavior before a violent event almost always reveal something critical about why it happened, how it escalated, and whether it could have been stopped. In the case of Lazette King and Michael Ellis, the pattern is not subtle. It is not hidden behind closed doors or protected by silence. It was visible. It was documented, and it was already known to the people who were closest to both of them. Michael Ellis had a criminal history that stretched back years. According to prosecutors, he was a habitual offender. His record included at least 6 drug-related charges, specifically for possession of crack cocaine, and 4 assault charges, 2 of which involved family members. His most recent assault conviction was in 2018, for which he pleaded guilty. He had a documented history of violence against the people closest to him, and that history was not a secret. It was on paper, it was in the system. King's family told reporters that Ellis had pulled guns on Lazette King before. Not once, before. As in, this was a known behavior pattern inside their relationship. He had threatened her with firearms in the past, and she had continued in the relationship. And before anyone sitting at home begins to form a quiet judgment about why she stayed, it is worth pausing to understand something that the research on intimate partner violence makes unmistakably clear. Leaving is the most dangerous thing a victim can do. The period immediately following a separation, or an attempted separation, is statistically the period of highest risk for lethal violence. Women are most likely to be killed by their partners when they are trying to leave. And the fact that Lazette King and Michael Ellis had reportedly broken up, but were still living together, places her squarely inside that window of maximum danger. She was not naive. She was not in denial. She was navigating an impossibly dangerous situation with the limited options available to her, and she ran out of time. Her family described the relationship as volatile and unpredictable. Her sister Shatina Thompson said it plainly. It was not the kind of relationship anyone who loved Lazette wanted to see her in, and they had hoped she would find a way out. But she didn't make it out. And the weight of that, the helplessness of watching someone you love remain in a dangerous situation and being unable to pull them to safety, is something that Thompson carried before this night and will carry forever after it. What makes the dynamic between Ellis and King even more psychologically complex is the layer that began to emerge in the days following his arrest: the conspiracy theories. Multiple sources, including Ellis's own sister, described a man who had been consumed by paranoid beliefs in the weeks and months before the murder. Specifically, Ellis had reportedly come to believe that Lazette King was working with the government, that she had been placed in his life as part of a coordinated effort to harm him, that the woman he lived with, the woman he had spent 6 years with, was an operative of some kind, a spy, a plant, an agent of forces working against him. This is not an uncommon presentation in cases involving untreated or undertreated paranoid schizophrenia. The delusion attaches itself to the person closest to the sufferer, the person who represents intimacy, vulnerability, trust, and reframes them as a threat. And once that reframe takes hold, once the delusion is stable and reinforced, the person experiencing it begins to process everything through that lens. Every argument becomes evidence of the conspiracy. Every moment of disagreement becomes confirmation. Every normal human interaction gets filtered through a framework in which the other person is an enemy. Ellis had previously been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. His sister told investigators she believed he was off his medication at the time of the murder. She said she believed he was in the grip of a psychotic episode when he pulled that trigger. And this is where the case becomes genuinely legally and morally complicated, because two truths can coexist simultaneously. A person can be experiencing an acute mental health crisis and still be capable of deliberate, sequenced action. A person can have a diagnosed psychiatric condition and still make choices that require planning, awareness, and intent. And King's mother, Vicky Kyle, made this point with a clarity and a force that no legal argument can easily dismiss. She said, and the words are worth reflecting on, that photographing her daughter's body and sending those images to family members is not the act of someone who doesn't know what they're doing. It requires locating your phone. It requires framing a shot. It requires selecting a recipient. It requires hitting send. And then it requires sending a message alongside those images announcing your next target. That is not a chain of behavior that suggests a person is lost in psychosis. It suggests a person who is acutely aware of what they have done and who wants the world to know it. King's family disputed the mental illness narrative, not necessarily because they disbelieve Ellis's diagnosis, but because they refuse to accept that diagnosis as an explanation that excuses or explains away what happened to their loved one. And that distinction matters enormously, both in a legal context and in a human one. Let's talk about the manhunt, because it is its own chapter in this story, and it reveals something important about the nature of the threat that Ellis posed in those hours between the shooting and his arrest. After allegedly killing Lazette King, after shooting a man on South Loop East earlier that evening, and after sending those photographs and threatening the King family, Michael Ellis disappeared into the Houston night. He had a roughly 4-hour head start. He was armed. He was considered dangerous. And he had made an explicit statement, at least according to the account relayed through his own sister, that he intended to continue his rampage. Houston police treated the manhunt accordingly. This was not a passive search. The King family was actively relocating, moving their parents away from an address Ellis knew by heart. Investigators were coordinating across multiple scenes: the South Loop East shooting, the apartment on Fairway Drive, and the potential threat to a family in a third location. The scope of danger that one man created in the span of a single night was extraordinary. The arrest came around 3 a.m. Wednesday morning, roughly 4 hours after the call that brought officers to Lazette King's apartment. Ellis was found in the Willowbrook area, a neighborhood on the northwest side of Houston, approximately 30 miles from the scene of the shooting. He was taken into custody without incident, which is its own strange detail in a case full of strange details. A man who had allegedly shot 2 people that night, threatened an entire family, evaded law enforcement for hours, and then surrendered without resistance when officers found him. There is often a quality of collapse to the end of these situations. The bravado, the escalation, the violence, and then, when confronted by actual authority, the deflation. It is a pattern that forensic psychologists note frequently in cases of domestic homicide. The aggression is targeted. It is intimate. It is about power over specific people. And when that specific arena of power is gone, so is the fight. Michael Ellis was taken to the Harris County Jail. He was charged with murder. He was also charged with unlawful disclosure of intimate visual material, a charge that speaks directly to the decision he made to photograph and distribute images of Lazette King's body. That charge exists in Texas law precisely because legislators recognize that this kind of violation, using someone's image without consent in a degrading or harmful way, constitutes its own category of harm, separate and distinct from the underlying act of violence. It is a charge that, in this context, carries a weight that goes beyond the technical legal definition. It acknowledges that what Ellis did to Lazette King in those final moments was not just one act. It was two: the killing and the display. His bond was set at $915,000. Now we have to talk about something that doesn't appear in most of the news coverage of this case. Something that the King family's mother shared with reporters in the days after her daughter's death, and something that reframes this story in a way that is almost too painful to articulate. Lazette King had a twin sister, and that twin sister died in 2001 from domestic violence. Vicki Kyle Lazette and her twin's mother sat in front of cameras in June of 2025 and said words that should stop everyone cold. "Both of my girls, my twins, over stupid stuff." 24 years apart, 2 daughters, the same cause, the same pattern, the same terrible outcome. That is not a coincidence. That is a family that has been touched by this epidemic twice, has buried 2 children at the hands of intimate partner violence, and it puts a frame around this case that makes it impossible to discuss as an isolated incident, because it isn't. It never is. Domestic violence does not exist in a vacuum. It exists inside communities, inside families, across generations. It perpetuates itself through silence, through systems that fail to intervene, through the cultural machinery that makes it possible for a man with 4 assault charges and a history of pulling guns on his partner to remain in that partner's orbit for 6 years without anyone stopping what was clearly, in hindsight, an inevitable collision. The question that Vicki Kyle's words demand we ask is not just, how did this happen? It's, why does this keep happening? Not just to one family, but to families across this country, across this world, with a frequency and a consistency that should constitute a public health emergency. And in many respects, researchers and advocates argue that it does. Intimate partner violence is one of the leading causes of death for women between the ages of 18 and 44 in the United States. It cuts across income levels, across racial categories, across educational backgrounds, and it is profoundly underreported, undercharged, and underpunished, which creates the conditions for men like Michael Ellis to accumulate lengthy criminal records involving violence against women and remain free, remain in proximity to the people they endanger. There is a behavioral concept that forensic psychologists call lethality assessment, a structured evaluation of risk factors that indicate whether a domestic violence situation is likely to escalate to homicide. Researchers have identified a cluster of factors that, when present together, represent the highest level of danger for a victim. Those factors include access to firearms, a history of strangulation, a history of making homicide threats, substance abuse, prior assault charges, the victim having recently attempted to separate from the abuser, and the abuser's belief that the victim is involved in infidelity or is working against them. In the case of Michael Ellis and Lazette King, multiple of those factors were present. He had access to firearms. He used one to shoot a man earlier that same evening. He had prior assault charges. The couple had reportedly separated, and he had developed a paranoid delusion that she was working against him, in one of the most extreme expressions of that last factor imaginable. By the lethality assessment framework, Lazette King was in an extremely high-risk situation. And yet, and this is the part that is hardest to sit with, there is no indication that any formal intervention reached the level required to remove her from danger. We don't know the full picture of what resources she accessed or didn't access, what calls were or weren't made, what opportunities the system had and didn't take. That information isn't always made public. But what we do know is that a man with a documented history of assault charges involving family members, with a known history of pulling guns on this specific woman, remained in her life and in her home until the night he ended it. And that is a systemic failure that stretches far beyond one apartment in Southeast Houston. Houston Police Department, in the aftermath of Lazette King's murder, released a public statement urging people to speak up. "If you see something, say something," the department said. It is a phrase that gets applied to so many different situations that it risks losing its force, but in the context of domestic violence, it carries a specific and urgent meaning. Because one of the most consistent patterns in intimate partner homicide cases is that someone knew. A neighbor heard arguments. A family member saw the bruises. A friend recognized the isolation. Someone knew, and either didn't know what to do with what they knew, or didn't believe it was their place to intervene, or didn't trust that the system would respond in a way that would actually help rather than escalate the situation. Shatina Thompson, Lazette King's sister, said, in the days after her sister's death, that if anyone is dealing with anything domestic like that, they should get out. That no one deserves what happened to her sister. That Lazette King did not deserve to die. And she said it with a force and a grief that makes the words feel almost insufficient for the size of what she was trying to express. Because when you lose someone to domestic violence, you don't just lose them to the moment of violence. You lose them to every moment that came before it, every warning sign that wasn't enough to change the outcome, every time you hoped things would be different, every conversation where you tried to say the right thing and didn't know what the right thing was. The legal case against Michael Ellis is still moving through the Harris County court system. He faces a murder charge and the charge of unlawful disclosure of intimate visual material. Prosecutors have described him as a habitual offender, and that designation carries significant legal weight in Texas, where habitual offender status can influence sentencing in substantial ways. His bond stands at $915,000, which means he remains in jail pending trial. The mental health dimension of this case is almost certainly going to be a central feature of whatever defense strategy emerges. The paranoid schizophrenia diagnosis, the alleged lapse in medication, the family's characterization of his state of mind in the lead-up to the murder, all of that will be examined, argued over, and subjected to expert testimony. In Texas, the insanity defense is extraordinarily difficult to mount successfully. The legal standard requires demonstrating that the defendant did not know that their conduct was wrong at the time of the offense. And as Vicky Kyle pointed out, the deliberate, sequential behavior in the aftermath of the shooting makes that argument significantly harder to sustain. But none of that legal machinery brings Lazette King back. None of it answers the question her mother lives with. None of it fills the space left by a woman who, by every account from the people who loved her, made the world warmer and brighter simply by being in it. There are few things worth understanding about cases like this one, cases that involve intimate partner violence, paranoid ideation, and a suspect who escalates over the course of a single night from one violent act to another to another. They are not as rare as we would like to believe. The warning signs in this case, the prior assault charges, the guns, the volatile relationship, the conspiracy thinking, the recent separation, are not unusual combinations. They appear together with a frequency that researchers find deeply alarming. What is relatively unusual is the decision to photograph and send those images. That behavior places this case in a smaller, more psychologically distinct category. Forensic experts who study homicide followed by display behavior, cases where an offender documents or broadcasts their act, often describe it as a combination of several psychological drives. The need for power and dominance has been channeled into an extreme, irreversible act. The desire for acknowledgement, not admiration, not approval, but recognition. A need to mark the act as real, to make it impossible to ignore or minimize. And in some cases, elements of what researchers call injustice collecting. The belief that the offender has been wronged, that their actions are a response to persecution, that they are communicating a message to the people who have supposedly worked against them. When you layer Ellis's reported conspiracy beliefs, his alleged conviction that Lazette King was working with the government against him, onto that behavioral framework, a picture emerges of a man who, whatever the legal determination about his mental state ultimately concludes, experienced what he did that night as a form of retaliation, as a response to a threat he believed was real and existential, which does not make what he did defensible. It does not make it understandable in any moral sense, but it does make it legible, and legibility in these cases is what allows us to identify the patterns, catch the warning signs earlier, and build systems that intervene before the worst possible outcome becomes the only one left. The trauma therapist who weighed in publicly on this case in the days after the murder made a point that is worth including here. She noted that when a relationship is described as volatile and unpredictable over an extended period, in this case, 6 years, what is often happening is a cycle of tension, escalation, incident, and reconciliation that becomes normalized for everyone inside it. The couple themselves begin to experience the escalation as routine. The family members watching from outside begin to lose the ability to distinguish between the crisis moments and the baseline. The outside world, which only sees fragments, never quite assembles the full picture. And by the time an outside observer, a neighbor, a responding officer, a family member, has enough information to recognize the full scope of the danger, it is often very late, sometimes too late. This is one of the reasons why domestic violence advocates push so hard for proactive intervention frameworks, for lethality assessment protocols to be used by law enforcement at the time of any domestic call, for follow-up services to be offered automatically rather than waiting for victims to seek them out, and for abuser intervention programs to be available and resourced. Because the window in which it is still possible to change the outcome is real, but it is narrow. And once it closes, no amount of investigation, prosecution, or public discussion can reopen it. Lazette King was 45 years old. She was a mother. She was a twin, and her twin had been taken by the same epidemic 24 years before her. She was described by her sister as someone with a big heart and a free spirit, someone who would do what she could for those who needed it. She was loved. She was seen by the people who knew her, and she deserved to live and to be safe, and to have the chance to get out of a situation that everyone around her recognized as dangerous, but that the systems designed to protect her never adequately addressed. Her name is Lazette King, and she deserves to be more than a headline. She deserves to be the reason someone watching this video right now picks up the phone, or has a conversation they've been putting off, or reaches out to a friend who's been struggling to leave a situation that doesn't feel safe. She deserves to matter beyond the moment of her death, and the only way that happens is if we take what we know about how these situations develop and use it to do something differently. The Houston Police Department said it in the aftermath of her murder: if you see something, say something. But it goes further than that. If you know something, say something. If someone in your life is in a situation that mirrors what we've described in this video, The volatility, the isolation, the history of violence, the recent or attempted separation, the partner who has access to weapons, that person needs more than hope. They need support, resources, and the kind of sustained, informed help that makes leaving not just possible but survivable. Michael Ellis sits in Harris County Jail tonight. The legal process will take its time. The mental health arguments will be made and challenged. The jury, if it comes to that, will weigh competing narratives about what he knew and what he intended, and what his diagnosis means in the context of what he did. And somewhere in Southeast Houston, a family is navigating what it means to grieve a woman they loved while also grieving the twin she lost 24 years ago, and processing the terrible reality that the same force took both of them. Some cases break something open that force a community, a city, a country to look at a problem it would rather not look at. The murder of Lazette King should be one of those cases. The decision to photograph and send images of her body is the detail that made national headlines, the detail that made people stop scrolling. But the real story, the story underneath that detail, is the one we have to be willing to sit with. 6 years of a relationship that everyone feared, a prior record of violence, a deteriorating mental state, a breakup that didn't produce physical separation, an escalation over the course of a single night that began with one shooting and ended with another, and a threat, communicated in the most degrading and deliberate way possible, to continue the violence further. That story is not a mystery. It is not a puzzle with a missing piece. Every piece was visible, and that is what makes it not just tragic but urgent. If this case moved you, if it made you think about someone in your life, if it made you want to understand this issue more deeply, share this video. Not for the algorithm, for the person who needs to see it, for the friend who's been making excuses for a partner you've been quietly worried about, for the family member who knows something isn't right but doesn't know how to step in. This is exactly the kind of content that saves lives when it reaches the right person at the right moment. Subscribe to Behind the Evidence if you haven't already. Hit the bell so you never miss a case. We cover stories like this one, stories that demand more than a headline, that deserve more than a 5-minute news segment, that require us to sit in the discomfort of the full truth long enough to actually learn something from it. Lazette King deserved better. Her family deserves justice. And we owe it to her to make sure that her story doesn't just disappear into the archive of forgotten cases. Behind the evidence, there is always more, and we are always going to find it.